let's go mine some diamonds. I'm gonna teach you a secret technique to find diamonds really quickly.
All right.
It's called X-ray.
Sandbox games are great. It's the only genre where you can say your choices actually matter and not be lying. There's all kinds of sandbox games. Sandbox survival games, sandbox exploration games, sandbox games where you build, sandbox games where you don't build. But that got me thinking, right? Notice how I didn't just say sandbox? It's always sandbox something. Is there really no definitive sandbox experience? I mean, I can think of a plethora of games that are defined by a single word. The Binding of Isaac, roguelike, Yakuza, beat 'em up, Gungeon, pain in the ass. But I can't think of any game that is solely a sandbox. Every sandbox game kind of throws their own flair into the sandbox genre. Before we find a definitive sandbox game, we need to establish something. What is a sandbox game? Now I know that sounds a little backwards. How can we define exactly what the genre is before finding the definitive experience? Well, first we'll take a few samples that we know are sandbox games. Then we'll look at these games individually and strip them down to their basic concepts. Then all we gotta do is cross-check every sample to see which concepts are shared throughout the entire roster and which ones are more niche to their specific games. But isn't this a little unnecessary, you might be saying? If you're looking for the definitive sandbox experience, Minecraft is right there, dude, you say without realizing how stupid you sound. Minecraft isn't just a sandbox game. It's a sandbox survival. We're looking for a game that's just a sandbox, nothing more, nothing less. But what about creative mode? Well, that would defeat the purpose of the entire video, wouldn't it? The game has to be strictly a sandbox game, not a game and then a sandbox in a different game mode. Just to clarify something here, I'm not saying Minecraft isn't a sandbox game. That would be ridiculous. That would literally just straight up be a false statement. It's just not just a sandbox, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? But it is a good place to start. When you say sandbox, most people are going to think of this game. What concepts can we extract from Minecraft? Well, obviously, there's the building. Building is, for most people, the main draw here. You collect materials, then you build something with them. Another big aspect of Minecraft is exploration. The very first thing you do is usually run around and find a suitable place to build. So already we got two concepts, exploration and building. But not every sandbox game is gonna have you run around exploring and building. Garry's Mod, also a classic sandbox game, has a lot of the building, but none of the exploration. On the other side of the coin, we got Stalker Anomaly, a sandbox game with none of the building but a ton of the exploring. You run around the zone looking for anomalies and artifacts to maybe sell or use them to make yourself more resistant. You can find outposts with quest givers to make money. You can die to the same enemy a lot. It's a sandbox survival game just like Minecraft, but completely different in the way you play it. Fuck, dude, literally what do I do? So these two concepts aren't really gonna work. Building may very well be a sandbox element, but it's not a quintessential sandbox element, since a game doesn't need building to be sandbox. And exploring isn't a sandbox thing in the first place. Plenty of games of different genres have exploration in them, especially survival games. And now that I think about it, exploring is more of a survival theme than a sandbox one.
Are you ready for this? Ice!
When you think of sandbox, really you think of freedom. You think of not having a go, of being able to do whatever you want without any restriction. Terraria does not accomplish that. Now I know that's kind of a hot take, but stick with me. Although you can build and explore just like in Minecraft, you have a lot of restrictions as well. There's gear to progress through, there are bosses that need to be fought, and sure, you could argue that you don't need to do any of these things, but then you're not really playing the game at that point. Because if so, any game is a sandbox game. Isaac is a sandbox game. I can just sit in the basement and talk to the shopkeeper. Terraria has a narrative, it's just not explicit. And no, I'm not talking about the weird lore the developers put in the forums. I didn't even read that. Why did they do that? Like what? Beating the boss fights and progressing through gear while unlocking new biomes and areas to explore is the narrative. And again, obviously, I'm not saying Terraria isn't a sandbox game. That would simply be false, but it's not the one we're looking for. Minecraft does not have a narrative. You can do whatever you want right from the start. Terraria feels more like a adventure type game rather than a sandbox. I mean, how many of you beat Moonlord and kept playing the game? Compared to the people that beat the Ender Dragon and kept playing Minecraft, then you see what I mean. The concept should theoretically be the same. You beat the final boss, but you can still do whatever. Not in Terraria. In Terraria, what's more likely to go through someone's head if they beat the final boss is there's nothing to do anymore. But why? It's because of something I call free play. This is where that freedom feeling comes from. In a lot of games, you usually feel like you're on train tracks. The game might throw you in for a loop, maybe even send you down some quest lines that you can do out of order, but for the most part, you're following a narrative. Whether the narrative is just a train track or the actual plot of the game, doesn't matter. What matters is that the game will always make sure that no matter what path you take, you will reach an ending. Sometimes it's one ending, sometimes it's one of multiple endings. The game essentially conditions you to think that you can beat it, and after you do, you're pretty much done with it. Imagine it like this. Most games have paths. You can follow any of these paths any way you want, and in some cases you can even jump from one path to the other. But all of these paths will eventually reach an ending. The path will stop. A sandbox game doesn't have paths. It's a single massive box that you can run around in different directions any way you want.
Look.
Uh-oh. Starbound falls in a similar place that Terraria does. The main difference is the execution. Starbound puts you in these pseudo train tracks just like Terraria does, but it feels a lot less organic. There's like a main quest line you gotta follow to progress through the game, and here is an actual literal narrative, almost like the game was supposed to be an RPG before they turned it into a sandbox, which is funny because it happened the other way around. I guess the bottom line is that there is no definitive sandbox game. When a game is tagged as sandbox, it's more so because it's centered around free play instead of it being a genre itself. You could either explore or build or survive or all three at once and more, and it will make the game more or less a sandbox title. Nowadays, games have become too complex for them to be a single thing. They're all part of multiple genres with different elements from each of them. And although I still think it's important to use the correct boxes for each genre, you can't put them in a single box anymore. They're too big for it. That's the end of it. Never mind, I found it.